Hi, I'm Dr. George Yancey. Let's share some paradigms. What I'm sharing today is MAGA and who hates them. I ran across, playing with some data, it's something we social scientists do from time to time, an interesting dynamic that I want to show you. And then I want to talk about the implications of it, because I think there are implications of this. There's a question that's used in a survey. This question goes something like this. On a scale of 0 to 100, how much emotional warmth do you have towards a group and coolness? Where 0 is emotional coolness, one could say hatred, and 100 is emotional warmth. So just as an example, I'm a Texas Longhorn. I got my doctorate at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm faithful Longhorns. I'm hopeful for Manning and the season coming up. So if I was to answer that and you asked me about the Texas Longhorns, I'd probably put 100. If you asked me about Texas A&M or Oklahoma, I'd probably put them as a 0. Emotional warmth, emotional coolness. I just want you to understand this to help to understand the numbers I'm about to show you, okay? So in this survey, in the latest survey, which came out, I think, 2024, they asked about MAGA and conservative Christians. So what I did was I looked at people who are just progressive. In other words, they answered a question on your political ideology by either you're very progressive, or slightly progressive, and people who are conservative. Same thing. So let me show you the results, okay? So we see among MAGA, conservatives answered that question, and they rated MAGA 65. Fundamentalist Christians, they rated 59. Progressives, they rated MAGA about 10. Fundamentalist Christians, about 24. So just so you understand what this means is that among conservatives, they like MAGA a little bit more than fundamentalist Christians. Among progressives, and because the score is so low, I don't want to say like, but they had more hatred, if you will, towards MAGA than fundamentalist Christians on that 0 to 100 scale. So I hope you all follow along on that, what that means. All right, now let's break this down. What does this really get at? MAGA tends to create more extreme emotions than fundamentalist Christians. We can think of both of those groups, MAGA and fundamentalist Christians, as groups associated with the political conservative wing of our country. I don't think that's even a debate, right? MAGA comes out of Trump, the head of the Republican Party. Fundamentalist Christians are associated with a more cultural conservative perspective against abortion, against homosexuality. As I've done this work on identity politics among Christians, many of them are fundamentalists and sort of preaching you have to vote Republican to be a good Christian mentality. That's not controversial, is it? So we have two groups associated with the political right. One group is creating more love among conservatives than the other group. That same group creates more hate among progressives than the other group. MAGA appears to be a more powerful force in shaping political attitudes than fundamentalist Christians. I think there's some interesting implications of that. If we're going to that, if you like this sort of conversation, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, tell others about it, all right? All right, so what does this all mean? All right, I think to get at what it means, we have to have some interpretation of what MAGA may mean and what fundamentalist Christians may mean. It's a little bit hard to talk about what MAGA may mean because that's a more newer term, so I'll start with fundamentalist Christians. We know that conservative Christians, probably around 1970 and 80, really began swung towards Republicans. What's called the moral majority emerged, and that was the focus on these cultural issues, abortion, homosexuality, and there was talk about cultural war against, more modernist ideas of family, sexuality, gender roles. And that's been part of this political struggle between conservatives and progressives on these cultural issues. And a lot of work has shown that perceptions of Christians, conservative Christians, has been tied to conservative political ideology or being Republican, in part because of their ideas on these cultural issues. Given that, a lot of fundamentalist Christians and our attitudes towards them is geared towards how we think about their positions on these cultural issues: abortion, homosexuality, gender roles. So, quite naturally, conservatives who tend to be more traditionalists on these issues like the Christians, fundamentalist Christians, more than progressives do. But they like MAGA better. I would contend that this probably would not have happened even 4 years ago, that a lot of the fight between our political parties was on these cultural issues. Not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it was. But MAGA has come. And what does MAGA represent? There's not much work on MAGA as there are on conservative Christians or fundamentalist Christians. But what I would argue that a lot of what MAGA is this notion of draining the swamp. What does that mean? I mean that a lot of what MAGA talks about is a distrust of our social institutions, education, government, media. If you look at a lot of Trump's rhetoric, it's about this distrust of these issues. And indeed, because of this sort of distrust of these issues, I think it motivates MAGA to want to tear things down, burn it down. There's a certain burn it down mentality in MAGA. I think we see. I used to think that the coarseness of Trump was a bug of his candidacy. He won in spite of it. Now I believe that is a feature. It is part of what attracts a certain type of person who feels disaffiliated from these institutions to him, and thus to the Republican Party. If my assessment, my speculation, if you will, is correct, that means that what has overcome now this concern on cultural issues, which that concern is still there, is this distrust of social institutions, which creates more love among conservatives for MAGA than conservative Christians, but also progressives who are highly supportive of issues such as education and the government and media. And they hear this burn all down mentality, develop a higher animosity towards MAGA than they do towards fundamentalist Christians. This, I believe, is where a lot of the alienation, political alienation, we see in our society. And understanding, I'm not taking a role in this. I'm not taking a side. But understanding this can help us understand why there is so much polarization and combat in our society. I'm not saying that those cultural issues do not matter. They clearly do. There's still some Christians who vote almost basically purely on these cultural issues. And I believe there's some on the left who will vote against Republicans because of these cultural issues. I'm not saying they are not important at all, but it appears that they may be less important. The notion of what should we do about our social institutions? MAGA, burn it all down. Progressives, save and strengthen those institutions. That is where I think the fight is in our society today. And how you feel about it may determine. And I think it even explains some of the movement, other Republicans, away from a Christian mentality. Because a lot of the leaders now, the Republican leaders now are not religious, starting with Trump. Secondary Kennedy is another example. You can think of other examples. A lot of leaders are not religious, yet they've taken control in part because of how they feel about our social institutions. Well, I hope this is insightful. I hope this is interesting. And if it is, please come check me out. Come back. We can shatter some more paradigms.